Today, China has risen to the status of a superpower. Smaller countries in its neighborhood and elsewhere look at it as a hegemon that exploits vulnerable countries. Its predatory policy of lending huge amounts on extortionate rates has sent countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka into massive debt traps. But there was a time when China was a victim of unequal treaties enforced by Western great powers as well as Russia and Japan. In fact, it suffered what is now termed as the 100 years of national humiliation. This term is used in China to describe the period of subjugation of the Qing Dynasty, which was ruling at that time, and the Republic of China by Western powers and Japan from 1839 to 1949. It's more than a century, actually, 110 years. It all began with the opium trade in the 18th century, which was dotted with two opium wars. Opium came to China circa 6th century AD through Arab and Turkish traders. The quantities of imports were small. The quantities were small because at that time opium was used only for medicinal purposes in China and many other countries, especially in the East, in the Orient. However, in the 17th century, tobacco entered China from North America, which gave birth to the practice of smoking tobacco in combination with opium. This happened during the Qing Dynasty's tenure, which lasted from 1644 to 1911 and 12. In 1773, the British East India Company had established a monopoly on opium cultivation in Bengal and became the leading supplier of opium to China. Other Western countries also joined in the trade, including Portugal, United States, which United States especially dealt in Turkish and Indian opium both, France and many other countries from the West which started selling opium to in the Chinese markets. Those were the times when Britain and other Western countries had a prolonged trade imbalance with China, and this trade balance was massive. There was an insatiable demand in Europe for Chinese tea, silks and porcelain. Since the Chinese had little use for European goods, the European traders had to pay for Chinese products with gold and silver. The opium trade, which created the opium trade, which was started by the Western countries on a massive scale, it created a steady demand among Chinese addicts for opium, and it solved the chronic trade imbalance. Now the balance of trade went in favor of Europe and against China. The addiction to opium spread so wide and deep that it affected even the imperial troops of China and its official classes. And this alarmed the Yongzheng Emperor. He ruled between 1722 to 1735. And he banned the sale and smoking of opium. This step could not stop the opium trade. Naturally, the Europeans were too cunning for him. In 1796, the Qing Emperor outlawed the import and cultivation of opium once again, but in vain. It did not change the situation on the ground. The East India Company circumvented the ban by outsourcing to private traders, which were actually licensed by the company to take goods from India to China. Now what these traders did was they would take the opium and then sell it to the smugglers from the Chinese coast, and they were locals, the Chinese, and in return they got the gold. The gold and silver which the traders received from these smugglers were turned over to the company. The amount of opium imported into China increased from about 200 chests annually in 1729, very small amount. It somehow skyrocketed to 40,000 chests per year in 1838. Each chest weighed about 64 kg. The local officials could be easily corrupted and convinced to connive in the spread of a network of opium distribution throughout China. During the Daokong Emperor's reign, the morally incorruptible imperial commissioner Lin Zexu instituted laws which banned opium throughout China, and he followed it up by arresting hundreds of dealers, and opium worth about 3 million pounds sterling was destroyed. The war became inevitable. The European interests were being threatened. An expeditionary force of 44 British troops, 44 British ships, not troops, they invaded Canton, the Chinese port of Canton. It was an unequal war. The British had steamships, heavy cannons and rockets. Their infantry was equipped with rifles, which were the latest, and they were capable of accurate long-range fire. On the other hand, the Chinese had slow-moving sail ships and rafts. Their troops had matchlocks that became ineffective beyond 50 yards and could fire only one round per minute. So, as a consequence, only 69 British troops were killed in that war, while 18,000 Chinese soldiers were killed or wounded. The First Opium War ended with the signing of the Nanking Treaty on 29 August 1942. It was signed aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis. The signatories were Sir Henry Pottinger on the British side and King Yilibu and New Jiang, who represented the Qing Dynasty. It was an unequal treaty, which proved to be the first of several such unequal treaties that followed. Now, under this treaty, British citizens in China acquired immunity from prosecution under the Chinese laws. China agreed to cede the Hong Kong island together with some small nearby islands to the British Empire and open the Chinese ports of Canton or Guangzhou. Now it's known as Guangzhou. Earlier it was known as Canton. Then Amoy, which was at that time known as Amoy, now it is known as Xiamen. Fuzhou, which is now known as Fuzhou. Ningpo, which is now known as Ningbo, and Shanghai, which is still known as Shanghai. And these ports were open to the foreign traders. China was forced to allow British missionaries into the interiors. British merchants established spheres of influence in and around British ports with impunity. British ports in China. Great Britain also received fixed tariffs, extraterritoriality for British citizens in Chinese soil, even if they went on the Chinese mainland or on the Chinese soil, they would not be treated as Chinese citizens but as British citizens, and they could not be arrested or prosecuted. And then the third was that Britain earned for itself the most favored nation status. The equivalent American treaty forbade opium trade, but as British and American merchants were only subject to the legal control of their consuls, not of the Chinese, so the trade continued despite the ban. The Chinese officials were reluctant to enforce the Nanking Treaty and other unequal treaties imposed by France and the United States, and these two treaties were actually signed in 1844. To make matters worse, Britain demanded additional concessions from the Chinese in 1854, and these concessions included the opening of all of China's ports to foreign traders, a 0% tariff rate on British imports, and legalization of Britain's trade in opium imported from Burma and India. But the Chinese resisted these demands until the Arrow incident happened on October 8, 1856. Now, what was this Arrow incident? The Arrow was actually a ship which was registered in China, but it was based out of the British colony of Hong Kong. Chinese officials boarded the ship and arrested its crew, which they were legally justified as the ship was being used for smuggling opium. But Britain demanded that China release the crew. जिसकी लाठी उसकी भैंस. Although the Chinese complied, the British destroyed 4 Chinese coastal forts and sank over 20 Chinese Navy boats. Since China was already in the throes of the Taiping Rebellion, it had little military power to spare to defend its sovereignty. Now, what was this Taiping Rebellion? Taiping was also known as the God-worshipping society. It drew its teachings from Confucianism, ancient Chinese texts and Christian beliefs. The Taiping Rebellion began in the southern province of Guangxi when local officials launched a campaign against this particular sect. The Taipings wanted to overthrow the ruling Manchus. This rebellion claimed more than 100 million lives, 10 crores. And this war was one of the bloodiest in human history. The 1857 War of Indian Independence drew Britain's attention away from China for a while. It must have been a respite to the Chinese. But once the Indian revolt was crushed and the Mughal rule abolished, Britain refocused on China. France joined Britain in the Second Opium War. China surrendered and was forced to sign the punitive Treaty of Tencin in June 1858. Why do I call it punitive? Because it allowed Britain, France, Russia, and the United States to establish embassies in Beijing. It had to open 11 additional ports to foreign traders and allow free navigation for foreign vessels up to the Yangtze River. The foreigners could now travel into the interiors of China, all foreigners, not just the British missionaries. And once again, China had to pay indemnities for the war the British had started, not the Chinese. In addition, the treaty mandated equal treatment for the Chinese who converted to Christianity and legalization of trading in opium. That, of course, they would keep on pressing China for that. Britain also received parts of coastal Kowloon on the mainland across from the Hong Kong island. These unequal treaties provoked the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. The reaction was bound to set in sooner or later. The Chinese is a civilization, an ancient civilization, and like India, they are also ancient and they do have a lot of sense of self-respect. So, these unequal treaties provoked the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. It was a popular uprising against the invasion of China by foreign peoples and foreign ideas such as Christianity. The Boxer Rebellion supported the peasant uprising of 1900 that attempted to drive all foreigners from China. Boxers was a name that foreigners gave to a Chinese secret society. Its Chinese name, when translated into English, meant, or even now it means, riotous and harmonious feasts. They originally aimed to destroy the Qing Dynasty and the Westerners who had a privileged position in China, because the Boxers believed that the Qing Dynasty was responsible for the invasion of foreigners or Westerners into China and grabbing privileged positions. The Boxers were powerful in North China. But in 1898, conservative anti-foreign forces won control of the Chinese government and persuaded the Boxers to drop their opposition to the ruling Qing Dynasty and unite with it in destroying the foreigners. And naturally, the foreigners they responded with a lot of venom. An international foreign force comprising soldiers from Japan, Russia, Britain, USA, France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary captured Beijing on 14 August 1900. While the foreign troops looted the capital, the Empress Dowager fled. After lengthy negotiations, an agreement was signed in September 1901, providing for reparations to be made to the foreign powers. Once again, it was the foreign powers who get the reparations. What was the effect of these two opium wars, especially the Second Opium War? The Second Opium War marked the beginning of the Qing Dynasty's decline into the oblivion, and it ended with the abdication of Emperor Pui in 1911. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Soviet government terminated most of the privileges gained by Tsarist Russia under the unequal treaties. Between 1928 and 1931, the Chinese nationalists persuaded the Western powers to return the tariff autonomy to China. But Britain, France, and the United States did not relinquish extraterritorial privileges until 1946. The British restored sovereignty over Hong Kong to China in 1997, and the Portuguese did the same in the case of Macau in 1999. This is how, finally, China's national humiliation century ended. But today, China itself is an aggressive power, does not hesitate from imposing its will and conditions on the poorer and weaker countries.